here's a trimming demo. For the wheel. First thing is you get your pots thrown, cut off. Hopefully you did some pre-trimming, left this kind of clean down here. If you didn't, then you're going to have to deal with that. And you get it, make sure it's stiffened up to leather hard, it's holding its shape well, but not too dry. Definitely no whitish edges where it's starting to get bone dry. I find it's typically better to go a touch on the soft side rather than a touch on the stiff side. If for no other reason than if you find it's too soft, you can let it dry a little bit longer or use a torch to stiffen it up a little. Whereas if it's too stiff, then it's much harder to get it wet again. So I'm going to get some little wads ready to hold it down, of preferably the same type of clay, but it doesn't matter a lot. And they should be on the stiffer side as well, but still plastic. So I'm going to set it down. I use the rings here to determine whether the rim is as close to the middle. That's really pretty close. And if you've thrown it perfectly evenly, then if the rim is centered, the bottom is centered. This isn't thrown perfectly evenly, either because it was wrong when I cut it off, or I messed with it a little bit. And I have moved it a few times, and each time I move it, if I compress it a little bit on one side or the other, it will get crooked. But I'm only going to be trimming from here to here for the most part. I'm going to leave all of this area alone. I got that part finished when I was throwing it, so I only need to have this part centered. And so I'm going to go to right about here and hold my finger still where it's not touching, move it slowly in until it just barely touches right there, and I stop it right where it was touching, and then I'm going to push it that direction away from myself, half the distance that it was wobbling, or thereabouts. So it was wobbling to my eye about twice that amount, and so I just moved it that amount. Now let's see how close I was. Okay, it's still wobbling, but not nearly as much. And right there, there, and I want to look for example, if I've got this little mark here, I want to look for where my finger's hitting as that particular piece goes around. And so it's about an inch or two past it, so I'm going to stop the wheel where it hit. It was right about there, and now I'm going to push it off center that way just a little bit and check again. Now that right here is just about perfect. This is still wobbling a bit, but I'm going to assume that when I did my pre-trimming, I cut this off a little bit unevenly. And so I'm going to trust this part right here more than I trust this part. So now I'm ready to put down the little wads. If you push the wads into the side, you're likely to dent it. You want to put the wads next to it, but not quite touching. You can kind of see right there, it's not quite touching, and I'm going to push down both of those at the same time and let them expand into the clay, expand until they're pushing against the clay. Notice it's not coming up very high at all. This doesn't keep it from tipping over, it keeps it from sliding around. So I'm only trying to keep it from sliding. And I pushed both sides at the same time just in case one of them had a little more force than the other and it might have pushed it off center. As I pushed it down, it might have pushed it off center, but since I'm pushing both at the same time, then it's more likely to stay centered. Even so, I'm going to check again, make sure it's still centered. And it looks pretty good. There is the faintest little wobble right there, right here. And so now I'm just going to kind of press that into the wad over there and then push this one down a little bit more. So I do my really fine-tune adjusting later, and it looks like this may be shifting a little bit more than I want it to, because that moved more than the bottom moved, So I think that somewhere in here is soft enough that it's tipping and shifting a little bit. And if I feel across the top, yeah, there's a little bit of an up and down rise. If I can find that up and down rise, I might be able to correct it by just pushing the part that's up down a little bit, and that should help this to be more centered right there, there. And push it just a little bit, and there we go. That's pretty good all around. It's actually more centered right here and a little less right there, but that's fine too. I suspect if I had a wobble when I was throwing it, it was more likely to be here. This, when I'm pre-trimming, may have been a wobble, but somewhere in between there is where I've got my thing. So a lot of people, I don't particularly like using this tool much. It's good for smoothing out and cutting off larger areas. You can go ahead and start. You want to start with the bevel. So bevel goes first, like that. And once I've done the bevel, I'm going to start in here, and you can do the bevel with this tool as well. I'm going to start trimming out the extra thickness through this area. The top 2/3 I threw to the consistent thickness that I wanted. I left some extra thickness down here to hold up the weight of the clay up there while this clay was still plastic. Now this is leather hard. I don't need the extra thickness down here, and so I'm going to trim that away, but I'm going to leave this edge right there, the top edge of the bevel, and bottom edge of the glaze catch, if I'm thinking of it right side up, since it's upside down right now. Anyway, that edge, I'm going to leave that, so I won't trim all the way off. I'll trim, and that is what's going to form my glaze catch. So I kind of trim right from there. The smaller the edge that's pushing against the clay, the deeper it's going to cut with less pressure. So I want to not push very hard. This hand is here to stabilize it and help it to keep from tipping over as I press down a little bit. If your bottom is a little soft or thin, you can put a trimming lid on there, so as you push down, you're not likely to push your finger through. So it spreads out that pressure over a larger area. And I don't have one on me right now, but it would be kind of like that, you know. So when I push here, it's spread out over that whole area. And usually we have just like baby food jar lids or juice lids or whatever that are wide enough to spread out that fingertip pressure. Right now I don't think I need that, so I'm going to go here, but I don't want to push very hard or it will tip over. So I'm going to trim in. Pretty sure I have at least that much that I needed to trim in, and then I don't want to jump across these. This is a little on the wet side. If it's coming off in ribbons like this, it's not too dry, but if they're sticking to your tool, if it's sticking a lot, it's too wet. Sticking this much, it's on the wetter side. Like I said, that's kind of what I prefer, especially when I'm going to sculpt into the side later. I need it to still be pretty soft when I do my trimming. But it does stick to the tool just a little bit. And if it wraps around too much, it'll stick and then cause the tool to jump as it comes around and it hits over that little bump there. So I need to be careful about that. A couple of things that you can do to help mitigate that when it's a little bit soft: a wire loop instead of a ribbon loop. Tool can trim without having it stick as badly, just because it slides off of a wire more easily than it slides off of the ribbon. And I even have some of these that are shaped more like your trimming tools, so you can do the kind of refined shapes. These don't work as well when the clay is too stiff. but they work pretty well when it's soft like this. And those are generally in the gray bins, marked wire loop tools. I often, for smoothing, instead of using that one with the straight side, because I have so many curves and just the way I like to do it, I will push in right here and kind of roll across. And so I make these, this one's out of a bandsaw blade. I've made them out of strap steel and other things. And the bandsaw blade, if I use the other side, I can use it to decorate and leave a texture like that, where I've got these kind of overlapping lines. I'm not going to do that on this one because I am going to sculpt a face in it. So I've got other plans for the decoration. But now I'm going to test with pressure just to see if it's feeling really solid. You don't want to push too hard or you'll make a dent anyway, especially when it's soft like this. But you can kind of feel leather hard clay has just a little bit of elasticity. It'll press in and you'll feel it flex, but not actually collapse in. So it takes some practice and time to kind of get the feel of how thick the clay is with that method. Until then, you can kind of do the little flex test and then take it off and check and then put it back down, get it recentered, so that you know better. It takes a bit more time, but less time than having to start all the way over because you trimmed through. So I've smoothed out that, and I'm generally going to finish getting rid of all of the thickness here before I trim anything else up here. Because as I'm trimming in here, if I need to bring this in narrower, and right now that foot's looking a little bit big, and so I'm going to narrow it. What that does is now I just cut off my bevel, or part of it. Now that bevel's still plenty big, but I may end up cutting off so much that I have lost the bevel altogether. And if that happens, then if I've already trimmed my inset foot, when I redo a bevel, I don't have anything for it to rest on. So I save the inset foot for last, always. It's a really good idea. Nearly every time. There's always exceptions, but that is the rule. So now to trim, well, first to see if I'm ready to trim the inset foot, if I've trimmed all of the thickness out of there, I'm going to go and make a little mark in two of my little wads that are holding the thing in place, and then I'll make little tiny fingernail marks somewhere in here, something that I can easily smooth over. So I've got those little marks in place. Then I'm going to pull the other two wads off and gently pick it up, test it for weight, look at the inside, compare inside to outside. If I can get my hand in there still, I'll actually feel for where I've got thin spots and make sure I'm matching shape. It also gives me a chance to look at it more in profile. From the angle I'm looking at, I couldn't see that little line. I don't want that little line. I want it to be kind of a scoop, a sweeping curve. This is fine. It would fit a different pot if it had some more geometric lines through it, but with these organic lines, I want it to match the style I've got going. So now that I've checked that out, I'm going to take those two little marks, line them up with the two other marks right there and there, and then spin this around and put these little wads back in place. Now, most likely it's still just a little bit off center. You can see it's wobbling from where it used to be, but it's starting out within about 1/8 of an inch rather than starting out within about 1/2 of an inch or 1/4. So now I'm just gonna stop right there. So it pushed a little too hard into these. So I'm going to push it away just a little bit, push these down, and that is, it's within a 1/16 of an inch, which is usually fine. Much more than that of a wobble and it's going to cause problems. So I'm going to go right here and fix that wonky shape I had, because I didn't like it. And go across there. I had a little bit of bulk right there that I could take out. The rest of it was all pretty good. And then to do the final refining of the shape, I prefer to use my metal rib. The larger trimming tool will smooth it nicely, but this smooths it. And if I lay the tool, it'll scrape off a little bit. And if I lay the tool a little flatter, more like that, it'll burnish it. This is also the tool I use to finish refining my form when I'm pulling up, when I'm throwing the pot. So it really helps to blend that line from the throwing texture to the trimming texture and make them pretty much the same thing. And those little marks I made are gone now, so I don't have to worry about them. You can see the top is wobbling noticeably, but since that's not where I'm trimming, that's not really my concern. I'm going to scrape off that little bit right there and make sure this is all smoothed, and definitely burnish the foot. Again, burnishing, if I haven't gone over this in class yet, is rubbing it with something hard and smooth to force the sand particles down and allow the smooth particles to come up to the surface, kind of like working concrete. Similar to polishing, and even with a smooth, fine clay, burnishing will give it a glossy, glass-like finish when there's not big sand particles. But it's important to at least burnish enough to get the sand particles down in place and the rough trimmed texture away on the parts that are not going to have glaze. The glaze will smooth over much of this if I had left that and hadn't quite burnished it the way I did with that rib. This part here isn't going to have glaze, so it needs that extra burnishing. Now I'm going to use one of these trimming tools, and I'm going to just first draw a line, and I can use my needle tool to draw that line and double check and make sure that it's the same width throughout. If I cut down in here, I'm not going to have a foot that's thick on this side and thin on that side, that I've got it centered still. Checking that often is important. And then I'm going to, once I've checked that line, make sure I like it, it's good, I'm going to trim down a ways. And now when I trim back and forth, as I come out to this outer edge, I'll know to stop right at that little bump. Other times as I come back and forth, sometimes I'll sweep out just a little further on the one side. And this gives me a nice little edge to bump into when I'm doing that, so I don't sweep out further. This, I want to put very little pressure because I can't be pushing down on the top while I'm trimming right there. Sometimes I'll hold my hand right here, and if it catches, it will pull it off center this way, and then about by the time my reactions are in place, it will swing around here and it will slap into my hand. I grip it by right there and lift at the same time as putting my heel down to stop the wheel. So it looks like catch, whoop, and I lift. You don't want to try and stabilize it or catch it by going down, because you'll end up punching it into the splash pan and knocking it around there. Very much pressure at all on the rim will dent it when it's too soft and crack it when it's kind of stiff. And sometimes you don't even see the crack until after the firing. So you just end up with a cracked pot and you didn't know until too late. So it's good not to do that. I can kind of keep my hand up here if I'm being really gentle. So I'm not putting very much pressure, and I'm using the corner. So I'm making lots of lines. Sometimes these are really fun. You know, you can make a nice little spiral and make pretty decorative lines as you're doing this. Generally, I will smooth them out because this is where my signature stamp is going, or signature mark. I put my stamp with my full name, Wainwright, or at least my full last name, Wainwright here, and then I put my initials in a design down here across the bottom. The requirement for class is name, date, and class period. I also put the date, but I just put the year. I ask you guys to put at least the month and year. If you don't put the class period, I don't know where to put it on the shelves, so to make sure that it doesn't get mixed up with the other ones. And if you just put your initials, I have no idea whose it is. So, and that becomes a problem at several points. One, where I'm trying to put the piece where you can find it, and two, when I'm trying to give you a grade for it. If you've already done that, we can, you know, it becomes permanent, so I can still give you points, but make sure that you're putting your name, at least first initial and last name, or first name and last initial, so that we know who it is. So I've got BLW Wainwright, and I just put the year. You guys put the month and year. So it's, I'm not asking you to do much that I don't do. The only difference is you guys put your class period on there, which isn't something that professionals do, but there's nothing wrong with your student work being marked as student work. Professional potters will put the date on there, partly as a record of how old the piece is. It helps when they do like a retroactive show, or retrospective, I mean. They kind of show how their work has evolved over time, and having the dates on all of the pieces is important for, you know, their market value and things like that. So there really isn't a reason not to put the date. This one I'm just using a tool to smooth out that bottom. This one happened to work. Got these from Walmart. We've got some of these. You can use a rib or a spoon or whatever works. So I've got that. That's ready to go. I would put my signature stamp right there on the bevel. I'm not going to do that in case I decide to put the face on a different side and it doesn't line up. I hate when I do a sculpture and then I realize that I've already signed it and it's all crooked. So when I do my sculpting, after that, I will take care of the signature, and there's that. If I over squished the rim a little bit, I can get a chamois and smooth it out. And if I push one of my wads in too far, you can see there's a little bit of a flat side there. I don't know if that's from when I was picking it up or from the wads on the clay, but if I get a chamois, which is a soft piece of leather, get it wet, they'll be in the chamois bin, which is the mini bins by Sink 3. Get this little chamois, and I'm going to wrap that around like this, and just kind of, I can do it like that, or I can pinch and kind of wrap my fingers around, but slide that around the chamois, keeps a little bit of slip spread around, rather than having water drip down the side, which can cause cracking later on, as the one spot that's got the water on it is expanding as the water is soaking in, while everything else is shrinking as it's drying out. And then when the expanded portion that's all wet tries to shrink, there's too much tension on the rest of it, and so it cracks. So if you do drip water down one side, just get the whole thing wet. Wipe the water around. Don't just let it sit. And then it should be fine. But I do that, and then I can adjust, make it a little more circular. I'm going to have to do that a few more times, because as I stick my hand in there to sculpt, I'll end up stretching it a little bit. And then when I do my sculpture, I'll watch for things like that. I don't know what that was, but it and try and cover up any of those. When I'm putting my handle, I'll do the same. If there's any weirdness, I will try and put it on that side strategically to make it look more intentional and or hide it. So that's trimming. Once I've got it to this point, I've signed it, finished with the handle or sculpting or design or whatever else I'm doing with it, show it to me, I'll check it, and you can put it on the drying rack. This is when you want it to get bone dry so that it can be fired.